Hey Bio30s, and welcome to our discussion today on fetal development. Last video I discussed weeks 1 to 8 in the development of a human embryo, discussed all the stages there from the zygote to the morula to the blastula to the gastrula, all the way up to neurulation. And for today's topic, we're going to discuss sort of what happens after week 8, weeks 9 to 39, up to, not including though, next video we'll discuss birthing or parturition, but for today we'll finish up the development, the prenatal developmental stage before birth. Again, fetal development occurs through all 3 trimesters. Starts at week 9, which is about 4 weeks before the end of the first trimester, and then it continues into the second and third trimesters all the way to week 39, which is technically the birthing week. Unlike with the embryonic developmental stage, fetal development is mainly about refinement. There's not a whole lot in the way of, development of new layers or whatever. By the point that the embryo becomes a fetus, pretty much all the body systems, basically the blueprints are there, and we're just going to basically develop and build on those blueprints until we have fully functional biological organ systems that can work on their own once the baby is born. Just to give you a perspective of how big the fetus is, at week 9, the fetus is roughly only 6 inches long and begins to move. So by the time the embryo becomes a fetus at week 9, the embryo or the fetus at that point is motile. It's moving. The mother can't feel it yet at that point. It's not big enough to be felt. There are some tests that can be done as the baby develops. If there's any concerns about maybe a family history of genetic disorders, there are a series of tests that are standard, but there's also some tests that are not so standard. If a doctor feels that the baby is maybe at risk of contracting a genetic disorder, what can be done is a process known as a chorionic villus sampling, or CVS. Basically, as you can see in the diagram here, either I guess it's inserted through the abdominal wall, or it can be inserted through the vagina, the birth canal, through the cervix. But basically, what's going to happen is they're actually going to sample a piece of the chorion. Remember, there were those 3 embryonic layers that we talked about. There was the amnion, the chorion, the allantois, and the yolk sac. So pretty much at the point where the fetus is just becoming a fetus, they're still sort of labeled the chorion. The chorion eventually becomes the placenta, but in this case, they're going to sample the chorion, and they're going to use that to check for genetic or chromosomal markers that might indicate that there is maybe perhaps a chromosomal or a genetic abnormality in the developing fetus. During the first 4 weeks of fetal development, I've already touched on this already, but I just wanted to kind of recap it before we discuss the second and third trimesters. The placenta and the umbilical cord are going to basically be fully formed during that first 4 weeks of fetal development. And as you might remember, I discussed how the skeleton begins to form during the embryonic stage, but at that stage, it's only a cartilage skeleton. Well, during the first 4 weeks of the fetal stage into the end of the first trimester, that cartilage skeleton will begin to be replaced by bone, and that replacement will basically finish by the time the second trimester is underway. So those are some of the major things that you might want to be familiar with in that last 4 weeks of the first trimester. Again, as I mentioned, by the end of that first trimester, the cartilage skeleton is hardening into bone, as you can see here. And the external reproductive organs, which may not have been visibly differentiated during the embryonic stage, even though the chromosomal sex of the baby has already been determined, by the end of the first trimester, the external genitalia are fairly well recognizable. You can tell the male has a penis as opposed to not having a penis at that point. So that is sort of, those are some markers that can basically help identify the sex of the baby by the end of the first trimester. Moving into the second trimester, which are weeks 14 to 26, again, a lot of refinement, certainly not as much to remember here as what we discussed in the embryonic developmental section of the notes. Some things that you should be familiar with. The fetus is now actively turning inside the uterus. It begins to adopt the fetal position, that standard fetal position that you might be familiar with, the term of, because it's beginning to outgrow the amniotic sac as it's getting larger. The body begins to get larger in proportion to the head. Soft hair, eyelids, eyelashes are all beginning to form. Bone cells are now fully developed, so the cartilage has now been completely replaced by bone at this stage. And the fetus is now entered into regular sleep cycle. So the fetus is now sleeping on a regular basis and entering into kind of a normal sleep cycle, like a sort of like an adult or I guess a born human would have. By the end of month 6, which ends sort of the end of the second trimester, the fetus at this point has doubled in size. It's now roughly 12 inches in length, and it weighs about 1.5 pounds. So that's how big the fetus would be at the end of the second trimester. During this stage, more testing can be done to determine the health of the baby. One of the standard tests that's used with pretty much all pregnancies, at least in Canada, is the ultrasound. The ultrasound is generally conducted during the first, near the end of the first trimester, week 11 to 13. They do one, they try to schedule an ultrasound at that point to see how the baby is coming along, or the fetus is coming along at that point. And then they also try to schedule one at least between weeks 18 to 22. Now, an ultrasound is very much, all you're using sound waves to create a real-time visual image of the baby. Quite often when parents now get their ultrasound pictures, it's sort of a big deal. They'll post these pictures to their social media accounts. This tends to be one of the first images of the baby, and quite often with a lot of parents, they will proudly post their ultrasound pictures. But again, it can be used to determine things like obviously the sex of the baby. If you can determine at that point where identify the external genitalia at that point, whether it's a male or a female, if the parents wish to find out what the sex of the baby is ahead of time. And it can also, just indicate general health of the baby, just what's going on in there, giving it a visual sense. One other test that can be done during the second trimester, it's sort of similar to the CVS, the chorionic villus sampling test that I discussed about that you can use during the first trimester. In the second trimester, you can do a process known as amniocentesis or amniotic fluid testing. And this can be used, again, to diagnose chromosomal abnormalities, fetal infections if they're occurring, if there's any kind of infections in the uterus. Basically, what happens is they basically stick a needle into across the abdominal muscles directly into the uterus, and they basically take a sample of the amniotic fluid, and then they can test that for the fetal DNA, and just to see if there's anything wrong. As dangerous as that CVS process sounded earlier, and again, you have to be trained in order to do it properly. This is also a fairly invasive process, even a little bit more so than the CVS process. It does carry a small risk of a miscarriage when you do this technique. So doctors aren't normally doing this as a regular test during a pregnancy. It would only be done if there seemed to be some kind of an issue with the pregnancy and the doctor deemed it necessary to do this. Whereas an ultrasound, there's really no risk to the baby because you're just basically using sound waves to basically get an image of the baby from the outside. It can also be used, by the way, because it is a chromosomal test. This can also confirm the chromosomal sex of the baby, but there's certainly a lot safer ways of doing that than doing amniocentesis to determine the sex of the baby. All right, and we're pretty much near the end here. Like I said, it wasn't that much note-wise as compared to the embryonic developmental section that we just finished. Third trimester, it's going to be weeks 27 to 39. The fetus by this point is now turned upside down. Its head is facing toward the birth canal. Basically, the head is pressing up against sort of the area around the inside of the cervix at the bottom of the uterus. Brain cells are rapidly developing, up to tens of thousands per minute at this point. The last two body systems to fully develop in the fetus are going to be the digestive and the respiratory systems. This is why if there's a premature birth, that premature babies are often put under respirators because their lungs are not fully functional. We talked about this in Bio 20 briefly. You might remember we discussed this with the respiratory system unit. I talked about something called HDN, hemolytic disorder of the newborn, which basically what happens is the alveoli in the lungs have a lipoprotein that are inside of them that actually prevent the alveoli from sticking together when the baby exhales. Without that lipoprotein in the alveoli are like little wet balloons. Well, you know what happens with a wet balloon. If you put the wet balloon together, it's going to stick together. So that's why babies, when they're premature, have to be put on respirators, because that lipoprotein hasn't fully developed before the 9 months, before the 9-month due date of the baby. So that's why, you know, babies quite often when they're premature need assistance breathing, because the respiratory systems are among the last systems to develop. And I would definitely remember that. Whereas like the circulatory system is one of the first systems to get rolling the heart within 18 days of birth, and it's pumping blood well before the embryo becomes a fetus. The respiratory system is not necessary for the fetus until birth. So it's one of the last systems to develop, as well as the digestive system, because the baby doesn't require any food or nutrients when it's in the uterus, because it's receiving all of its nutrients through the placenta, through the umbilical cord into the placenta, getting the nutrients from the mother. The mother does all the digesting for the fetus while it's developing. If it's a male, the testes are going to descend into the scrotum of the male. So you basically get the gonads basically descending into the pouch that's sort of at this point empty, but the testes will actually drop at this point. And it's also at this point where you get the well-known baby fat. Fatty tissues are developing onto the baby at this point as sort of extra energy reserves for the baby before birth. And this is where the baby fat, if you have a baby that's very plump or whatever, this is where that baby fat is basically being laid on at the end of the 3rd trimester. And then basically after 9 months of development, as you can see right here, here's our kind of our time lapse of the embryo from month 1 all the way to month 9. Basically, it's time for the fetus to make its grand entrance into the world, and that's what we're going to be discussing next day in our final video for the reproduction and prenatal development unit. Please join me when I discuss the topic of parturition, otherwise known as birthing, and lactation. How does the human female provide nourishment for the newly born baby? For today, homework-wise, you're going to continue working on your prenatal development booklet that you started with the last video on embryonic development. For today, work on questions 8 and 9. That's going to leave you 10 and 11 to finish up when you finish up the next video. Again, that video being about parturition and lactation. Until then, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.